thank you very much. I'm sure when, like me, many of you knew already when Angkor was quite impressive. Spectacular monuments, but clearly the picture we have seen tonight show that there are not only the monuments, and there are much more things which may be quite impressive in that area. I think we have plenty of time for questions in the...
From this data, could you make an estimate of the population of not Cambodia, but in this area of Cambodia?
Okay, so the question was, using the data, can we make population estimates? And the answer to that is yes, it's an important first step. And this is something that's really underway. Most of the population estimates that you hear for Angkor are basically wild ballpark guesses based on various calculations and so on that have been misinterpreted by lay readers and so on as being precise populations. Now that we finally come to terms with the spatial structure of the city, we can start to do much more accurate demographic analyses. But the problem is that now that we know that the landscape scale layout of the cities, what we need to do is drill down into much finer detail using excavation and do household archaeology. Because it's not just a question of knowing that there's a certain number of hectares of mounds. You need to know how many people lived per hectare on these mounds. And really the very first household archaeology is just being done at Angkor in the last few years. And I think soon, in the next few years, we'll be in a position to start to make more accurate assessments of the population of Angkor, but for the time being, all we have are wild guesses. Although the sheer density of occupation in the landscape tends to support perhaps some of the higher estimates of population at Angkor.
You showed us very convincingly what this technology can do. I wonder if you could give us a little bit more about who developed it and where it was developed and what the original purpose was.
Thanks for the question. That's not really my domain of expertise. We actually do have one of our LiDAR engineers in the audience tonight who'd be much more capable of answering that question than I am, but correct me if I'm wrong, Chris, but essentially the technology emerged in the 1960s out of Canada, and its precise origins are a little obscure and probably evolved out of defense projects and so on, but was essentially first commercialized and popularized in Canada in the early or late 1960s, Chris? In the late 1960s, yeah. Up until recently, however, the technology is really progressing by leaps and bounds, and up until recently, it wasn't really sophisticated enough that archaeologists could use it effectively to cover large areas on a landscape scale. The technology has really only reached that point since 2008, 2009, 2010. And the technology is getting better all the time and is starting to be used quite widely in archaeology. But the devices were relatively primitive up until the last 5, 10, 15 years. Yes?
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful presentation. You started off saying that you wanted to find out about why the decline of Angkor. Out of this technology, have you now have some new answers to that?
Yeah, that's a fairly complex issue that could probably be the topic of a whole other presentation. But to encapsulate, and as I mentioned, has been one of our main, one of the main areas of research that we focused on over the last 20 years, one of our kind of big picture questions. And just to encapsulate that, it's becoming increasingly clear that the vast expansion of the city and an increasing over-reliance on the functioning of this water management system played a significant role. It was a significant factor in the abandonment of Angkor as the center of gravity of Khmer royal power in the 1400s. Of course, as we know, Angkor was never abandoned completely, and a large and thriving population persisted there for quite some time after its so-called collapse and abandonment. And that's one of the things I think that's coming out of our research, although I guess a couple of our colleagues would disagree, is that this idea of collapse somehow implies something that's sudden and catastrophic, that involves a mass exodus of people from some sort of calamity, whereas the evidence, at least from my point of view, points to essentially the water management system never really working all that well, but they kind of muddled their way through over the course of several centuries and managed to provide reasonably consistent yields of rice on account of the water management system. It didn't feed vast amounts of additional people, but what it did is it evened out these sort of peaks and troughs in annual rainfall variability and allowed them to produce fairly consistent yields, which they could convert into projects of temple building and empire building and so on. And eventually, as that system grew so large and created systemic problems due to degradation of the environment, that system ceased to work. And increasingly, as the centuries roll on, what you see is an urban densification. You start to see a move away from low-density, dispersed cities to having very densely inhabited downtown areas, which are full of tens of thousands, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people who are non-rice producers and are increasingly reliant on that system. So you have these kind of processes working in parallel, programs of processes of environmental degradation that are increasingly causing problems with the functioning of the water management system, even as you have the growth of a very, very, very large non-producing class of people associated with temples who need that system to work. And once the system breaks down, all of a sudden you don't have a mechanism for supplying the tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people living in downtown areas. And what you see is, at least in my opinion, a relatively long, slow, gradual decline on account of the failure of that water management system. I'm not sure that Christoph would agree with that assessment, but I think that's sort of in broad contours what our research has shown.
Do you see any increase in burials that would reflect even a gradual decline in the population?
Yeah, thanks for that question. That's something that I probably should have mentioned during the speech. One of the very frustrating things about being an archaeologist in a place like Angkor is that you're looking at essentially a Hindu-Buddhist milieu in which they cremate the dead. And so unlike other archaeological contexts, you don't have skeletal material to deal with, which from an archaeological point of view is unfortunate, obviously, because you could gain a lot of demographic information and as well as the life history of people that's recorded in their bones. For the prehistoric people of Angkor, we have that, but skeletal remains really start to disappear at around 400 or 500 AD, that kind of era. And so, yeah, it would be wonderful, but we don't have access to really any significant data sets of skeletal material for the Angkor period or after.
I was fascinated with the geometric layout of the city and how people lived, and that was repeated not only inside Angkor Wat, but outside as well. And when you went to other sites, you saw that repeated geometric pattern in perfectly almost straight lines. You hardly see that today. The way the cities are developed are more organic, and they hardly have that rigidity. What do you think it says about the civilization that produced these straight cities?
Thanks for that question. Yeah, I mean, you do see that at Angkor. You see both kinds of things at Angkor. You see urban areas that have apparently grown organically and sometimes quite chaotically over time, and then you do see these very highly organized and formally planned spaces as well. And so what it indicates that there's a degree of state-level intervention, basically, that the king is using his power and authority to embark upon very well-planned projects of urban renewal during particular periods, which very often wipe out pre-existing urban areas and so on. But basically, the king imposing his vision on a particular area of the landscape by ordering it. And so what you're seeing is basically evidence of a very sophisticated bureaucratic apparatus of architects, planners, engineers, and builders who are executing a particular vision of on the authority of the king.
You don't see it in any other civilization yet, do you?
Well, I mean, these kind of nice gridded cities and so on. I mean, the argument is that the argument of a couple of scholars anyway is that they're based on Indian models. That as with the temples themselves, that there are quite literal interpretation of particular texts that describe the ways in which urban spaces and temples should be laid out. The problem with that is that they don't exist really even in India at all. And so what we'd be seeing is essentially ideal Indian cities realized in Cambodia when they weren't actually in India. But they were in other places. You see nice gridded cities in places like China, for instance, throughout history. So it's not like it's something that's necessarily unique to Angkor. But in reality, the resemblance of some medieval Khmer cities to some Chinese cities of the same period and earlier is quite striking, actually, and is something that remains to be explored. Everyone always stresses the sort of Indian cultural influence and cultural connection, whereas on some levels, what you're seeing seems to be replicas of Chinese cities of the period, which may just be a total coincidence. I mean, it's a fairly basic, elemental, simple way of laying out a city in a grid according to cardinal alignments. So I'm reluctant to read too much into it. Others would love to have you believe that they're idealized models of Indian cities as per the Indian text, but I don't believe that.
Fabulous talk. I want to pick up on, you were talking about what might be applied here, and I think this could have enormous impact on the history of Siam, just because we have so little of conventional data in terms, so I think it could be enormously important, and particularly outside the old capital of Ayutthaya. Ayutthaya would be important too, but I think the really exciting thing could be elsewhere. We can, just by going to the other cities, Pitsanulok and Kampang Phet and Nakhon Si Thammarat and these places, we know just by looking around, these were clearly very big urban centers in the past, but they have disappeared from the history because they've left no conventional sources. There's no legends, there's very few inscriptions, and so on. But particularly in places, I think the two most exciting ones would be Sachinalai and Kampang Phet, because these two areas have not been, the old city areas have not been obliterated by modern urban development. They're still looking very much like what you're seeing at Angkor. They're basically forested. And if you go there even now and you go from the temple area center, and you walk out into the woods, you find them lots of these little community temples all over the place in sort of little ruins which you can still identify. So I think these areas would be fantastic, what we would find using this technique in this area. So, Christoph, welcome.
What have you been doing for the last 3 years? Yeah, it's a very good point, and a point well taken, and I would absolutely love to see the technology expanded into archaeological applications in other countries of the region. And fortunately, there's a group of our Thai colleagues who are here this evening, actually, who are working on just that at the moment. And I think the idea is to very quickly to follow a similar model to what we did at Angkor, to very quickly do a fairly limited proof of concept, which proves that it's useful and that it's not wasted money, essentially, and to parlay the results of that into something on a grander scale.
I'm a little curious about the laser. Is this a conventional laser? Is it a special type? Is it one of the ones that are used medically? Are these different?
I don't know. Chris, is there a microphone next to our LiDAR engineer down there?
No, it's just a traditional laser. It's actually eye safe, so we have to fly over 200 meters. You could be looking straight up at it and it would not affect your vision. And essentially it's just reflectivity. So the light goes down and then it's returned into the sensor. So yeah, it's quite safe and it's a high intensity laser, but very safe for the public.
I didn't know they had an eye-safe laser. We're always told it isn't.
Yeah, well, I mean, if on the ground, it would actually burn through a phone book. So it's very strong, but over 200 meters in the air, it would not affect your vision.
Doesn't hurt the pilot, just you.
Yeah, when we first started putting this mission together in 2012, we had a lot of concerns about this on the part of the authorities in Cambodia about potential negative effects on people, on the environment, on the structures themselves, and so we had to go through a very lengthy vetting process of getting approvals from UNESCO and certifications from the manufacturer of the instrument and so on, to reassure people that we wouldn't have, a million blind cows wandering the countryside of northern Cambodia and things like this, which we eventually satisfied, we eventually did to everyone's satisfaction, and they let us proceed. But it was a long process, actually.
May I thank you very much for the wonderful lecture tonight. I just wanted to tell our Siam Society friends and members that we are trying to do something about LiDAR, and Dr. Evans will be collaborating with us, we hope, in the future. We are doing the Phnom Rung because Her Royal Highness Princess Mahachakri Srinthorn did an epigraphy reading of Phnom Rung. So we are honoring her for the 60th birthday, and we hope that we will be able to go public as soon as we get funding. We are getting funding from various sources, but not the government at the moment, of course. But we will try our best. We will try our best, and perhaps they will give a little bit of assistance, say helicopters or whatever. But we will see. But many of our friends here tonight will be helping out a little bit here and there. And we hope that we will be able to announce something eventually, pretty soon. So I thank you very much for this lecture.
Thank you very much. I think it's time to close this nice presentation with a token of our appreciation for our speaker tonight. So join me to thank Dr. Damian Evans. Thank you very much for your attendance.